morning, good evening. How's it going,
Good
Sam?
evening. Good, whatever time of the day it is. So this intro, like it catches me every time because I'm sort of waiting for the final like zero countdown, but sometimes it stops like 3 seconds before zero. So it's always like,
Yeah,
um, is
I
this
don't know how to change
intentional?
that.
No, okay, fine.
Not on my side, but we could change the intro to make it more subtle. I don't know, it is a bit jerky. Yeah.
But it's great, it kind of it keeps us ready, right? Ready to go. Uh,
True, sometimes it's
yay.
surprise you in the middle of a dance, right?
Yeah, and well, it's better in the middle of the dance than in the middle of the sing. So
Yes. Same for me. Okay, well, welcome everyone to episode 8 of season 10 of Disasters Deconstructed. We're doing this season all on live stream, as you know, and welcome wherever you're joining or listening from. We're excited just to spend time with some more guests today.
as always. And so in this season, if you've been following us for last almost a year now, we've been talking about our project called Contemplating Catastrophe. So it's a book. Hopefully, it'll grow into something bigger. And we asked our friends, our colleagues from all around the world. That was, man, what, like 3 years ago, quite a while ago, to write a short entry about their favorite thinker, or the thinker who kind of maybe changed the way they understand disasters, the way they write, the way they think about disasters. And it started so small, and then it just kind of grew and grew and grew, and we're absolutely delighted that the project kind of has really turned into more than what we thought it would be. And so the book will hopefully be out next year. And so through the season, we are talking to the authors of these entries about their entries and about the thinkers that they chose to talk about and to write about.
Yes, indeed. And so last time, if you remember, we were talking about Japan, and now to shift the season forward, we're moving from themes to regions, and we're talking about the Philippines and Vietnam. And we're delighted to welcome back our friend Jake Kadag, who our listeners know for sure. And we also have a new guest today, Caroline Contillo. And it's great to have you both here on the podcast today. Welcome. Jake is an assistant professor at the University of Philippines, Diliman. He's worked with USAID on their flagship project on urban resilience in the Philippines, and his research largely focuses on participation and community work, particularly with the most marginalized communities. Caroline is a disaster resilience trainer and researcher. She currently works for the New York Office of Mental Health as their lead trainer. She's led workshops for climate activists and ecological justice workers for over a decade now. Welcome, Jake and Caroline.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Super fun to have you as always. We're really looking forward to this conversation. And so in this season, we have been starting every live stream, every episode with the same question, because we want to learn about your aspirations and inspirations for thinking and for your scholarship. So the question that we ask everyone on this season is, what do you read? And how have you started reading kind of that stuff that you're reading? What inspires you and your work? Jake, I'll start with you. What do you read and why?
Thank you, Kasaya and Jason. And these days, I've been reading a lot about the colonial and post-colonial works, especially those written by Filipino scholars and in Filipino languages. Well, I know that sounds, a bit uh, nationalist, but really that's not my agenda, and not the direction that I want to go. But I think I have been rediscovering that rich literature in the Filipino social sciences, especially from my university, and of Filipino intellectuals that really tried to move away from colonial ways of thinking, and of course knowing or doing science. Um, uh, but what I find, so for example, in the Philippines now in Department of Geography, we're working on Filipino geography. So we are trying to have our own post-colonial, no, not really our own, but the post-colonial social science. But what I find really important and very powerful in this work that they are not really about rejecting outsiders' ideas, but it's really kind of reclaiming Filipino ways of, or indigenous ways of knowing and doing science, and which I think we've lost, because of centuries of colonization, and I feel bad about it sometimes that I miss those works during the early stage of my career, 10 or 15 years ago. But now it's really inspiring for me. So once again, I'm seeing disaster, for at least disaster studies from that perspective. So yeah, that's what I'm reading now.
That's absolutely incredible, because indeed that literature, well, for most of us, it's inaccessible, right? But even when it is accessible, we don't tend to engage with this because of the way that we're trained. And just a little plug for Jake. For those of you, if you haven't seen Jake's special issue for disasters, that was 2 years ago, right, or 3 years ago.
Yes.
Decolonial approaches and scholarship in disaster studies. Please have a look at it. The intro was so nice. And then, of course, you've just written a preface for JC's and my edited book, and JC and I we think that'll probably be the most cited piece in the book, not the stuff that we wrote. So thanks for writing that. Yeah, super interesting. Thanks, Jake. Caroline, same question to you. What do you read? What inspires you?
Yeah, so a lot of my work deals with disaster mental health and the way that people and communities recover from disasters. So I've been very interested in the literature around mutual aid from people like Dean Spade's Mutual Aid 101. There's a book called Power When the Lights Go Out. So it's firsthand accounts of communities that come together in the wake of disasters to build resilience, often in that absence of formal assistance. I'm very interested in the field of interpersonal neurobiology that's looking at what emerges between people. It's this less individualized version of neurobiology. And this looks at, there's scholars like Dan Siegel who are looking at what happens between people under stress and how they build resilience. So that's a really interesting field to me. It kind of feels like a newer name for something very old that does come from things like indigenous methodologies, looking at the relationship between things instead of the things as separate entities. And things really shift when we look at those relationships and center relationships and reciprocity. And another place where I've been reading a lot about things related to that, the literature around climate psychology. So people like Panu Pikala, Susan Clayton, looking at why a term like climate anxiety, to look at the things that people experience in relationship to these disasters and disaster increasing conditions, why a term like anxiety might not be sufficient to describe what happens for people and between people, and the way that our emotions are information about the environment. And we can learn a lot of really interesting things about how people recover and build resilience from that.
Oh, wow. That sounds like super interesting. So this is the problem with this question. I kind of repeat it every episode. I just want to read another 5 books. So yeah, thanks, Caroline. You just perpetually, this never-ending list of books. But yeah, that sounds fascinating. I'm sure we'll come back to it as we talk through the episode today.
Indeed. Thanks, Caroline. And I'm so interested in what was it you mentioned about is interpersonal biology, or what?
Interpersonal neurobiology.
Neurobiology. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. And so for your entry, let's talk about that. You wrote about Thich Nhat Hanh, and wanted to just ask you why.
Yeah, so I wrote about Thich Nhat Hanh, which people might know he was a Zen Buddhist monk from Vietnam. He became a pretty world famous Buddhist teacher, his community Plum Village. I wrote about him, so my experience of Buddhism predates my experience with disaster scholarship. I practiced Buddhism when I lived in New York City for about 10 years. I ended up being an organizer for the Buddhist contingent of the People's Climate March. And I think that was where I really started to see the way that this relationship between Thich Nhat Hanh's perspective on interdependence, which he actually described, he called it interbeing, the way that we are not separate from the challenges that we witness in the world. So he was one of the kind of creators of something that gets called socially engaged Buddhism. So Buddhism not to kind of just feel more zen about what's happening in the world, but to engage with it and really wrestle with what happens when we see violence, as he did in Vietnam, as we see as climate-driven disasters are increasing. How do you really witness that and reckon with it? That feels really relevant to disaster scholars to me. So writing about this perspective that we're not separate from what's happening feels really important when so much of research relies on us imagining that we're an objective observer. What happens when that shifts?
So as a Buddhist practitioner, how do you think, and you said you came to disaster studies with that perspective. So just interested in how you think that gave you kind of a unique entry point compared to maybe what you see in the literature, like what you perceive of other approaches to disaster studies.
Yeah, I think, for me, it became really relevant. I was working with a group called the Consortium for Equitable Disaster Resilience, where we were doing research about why marginalized communities receive less funding and support after disasters. And so this is where I first kind of encountered that feeling of I should be separate from what I'm researching. And of course, there are, ways that is important to get articles published and things like that. So yeah, really kind of seeing how the research sausage gets made, but also having this perspective for myself that I know that I'm interdependent with who I'm studying, what I'm studying. The research needs to be useful for the communities that I am, doing this research with, and having a sense of remove enough to do the writing, to conduct interviews, to sit with the results, but also bringing myself to it, admitting that I have feelings about it, letting my emotions about the work be information about what's relevant and important. I think that felt like a very different way to encounter the work. And I think, it was interesting to work for and with a group where I was able to bring that to the table and make that part of the work we were doing.
Mm-hmm. And so obviously interdependence is central to Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, and you talked about some of the mutual aid literature, which I love your shout outs that you gave. And so I'm just wondering, like the synergy between those points of view, perspectives, and really it's like a personal commitment to other people that you're working with, not as research subjects, but as something more robust and more long term. And so I just wondered whether you had like practical like commitments or principles that drive that interconnection for you.
Yeah, I mean, I always come back to kind of the felt embodied sense that I had going out to the Rockaways after Hurricane Sandy, which was one of my first experiences. I was just going to visit a friend who was they weren't calling it mutual aid, but they were making and delivering soup to their neighbors out in the Rockaways, because FEMA and the Red Cross had taken so long to show up for various reasons. And the feeling of being part of something where nobody was asking people to make soup, nobody was asking somebody to pick up that soup and take it to an apartment complex and also check on people, make sure they had their medications. But not just witnessing that, but really feeling what it felt like to be a part of that really changed me. So I think for me, one of the practical things I would offer to people is that even when you're witnessing in the wake of a disaster, you can be witnessing a lot of suffering, a lot of loss. I think, Buddhism gives us a lot of tools and skills for being able to not just witness that loss, but engage with it and engage with people. Not be overcome by that, but to recognize ourselves as part of people moving towards each other to relieve suffering. So that's had a big impact on me. And I think that feels threaded into every part of doing this kind of disaster work.
What kind of other ways of thinking do you come across in your practice? In terms of mental health and things that you see often with folks you work with. I'm just thinking you have kind of this very interesting perspective as that kind of a practitioner. So you must come across kind of ways of thinking that are barriers to dealing with disasters.
Yeah. I think one of the barriers is sort of thinking about disasters as these acute events that happen to a person or community that is a blank slate, and our job is just to get people back to a previous level of functioning. I hear that a lot in especially the disaster mental health work that I do. And I think getting back to a previous level of functioning, to me, it's kind of this old version of resilience. I think something that the field of interpersonal neurobiology and some of the trauma-related work that's come out recently from people like, there's a book called The Politics of Trauma from a practitioner of somatics named Stacey Haynes. This idea that we can actually build resilience through these opportunities. Nobody wants a disaster to happen, but it can expose some of the foundational issues in a community like racism and poverty that make it harder for some people to recover from disasters. And then people can turn towards each other for building resilience around that, not just like the corporate version of resilience. We're just trying to bounce back, and that involves like gentrification and things like that. But a true resilience where people just don't just bounce back, they bounce kind of out of that paradigm.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. We can kind of keep talking about it because there is, I wish we perhaps engaged more disaster scholars with this thinking, because they seem to be quite, a lot of things aligning. So thanks for bringing this to us. Jake, I'm gonna come to you. So Walden Bello, why? I mean, you probably meet him like at work sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah, I met him, I think, twice. One in a cafeteria in the university, and then I think in one of the discussions with an NGO sometime after the pandemic. But I'm not sure if he remembers me. He's the superstar here, so he talks with a lot of people. And I know Walden Bello from his. He has various roles. He's an academic. He was a professor in the same college where I work now, and he's an activist. He was also a politician, and he's a party representative to the Congress, and I think now he's busy with a progressive think tank based in Bangkok that works a lot in Southeast Asia or Asia, and. So Walden or Bellis, he's for me he embodies the role of a public sociologist. It's more like, what we have in geography, the people's geographer. So I think every social science or discipline has that kind of branding uh, their discipline. But what strikes me when I read Walden Bellius' works is that he's also arguing on the same ideas that critical disaster studies scholars like us have been, or like many of our mentors, and have been arguing about and I think his main argument really is that all these development problems, such as the usual poverty, health issues, educational crisis, and also disasters, and later on in his works, or books about climate change, they're I think his main argument really is, they're tied to the prevailing political and economic systems that make people vulnerable, or that reduce vulnerabilities, especially for the marginalized groups. And I know that sounds very textbook, but if we look at the Philippines today, it feels like these arguments and ideas are really live experiences of many people. Uh, and like so for instance, I during the build era. So we have that kind of era here in the Philippines, very recent uh, uh, era, which happened in from 2016 to 2022. And I think he got arrested. Belly was arrested in 2022 for being so critical about that build era. So it's a massive infrastructure project that the previous administration uh, uh, did or started doing, and it's their view, or how do I say, meaning of development. But thousands of families, or probably hundred thousands, including indigenous groups, were displaced in the name of those massive infrastructure projects. So, and those are, I think, the same uh, processes of impoverishment or production of vulnerabilities that Bellio warned us about decades ago in his writings. And I think it's the same social cause that we identified in key ideas, like that disaster scholars identified in key ideas like progression of vulnerability model, disaster risk creation, and many other frameworks. And yeah, and I think he's right about it for many reasons. And about that build, because I mentioned it because I'm also writing something about it. But he's right about the prediction that it will continue. And now he's right. We have the build better more. The
Wow.
BBM, which is actually the
Wow.
acronym for the name of the current president. So, who is the son of the previous dictator in the 70s and 80s. So I think that is what Velio is really angry about, that this is really a systemic problem, and disasters are simply are manifestations of problems created by this authoritarianism, patronage politics. I think that's how I connect Belli's works to
Mm.
disaster studies.
Build better more. What a slogan,
Yeah.
this is next
That's
level up.
BBM, which actually
You know,
stands for Bongbong Marcos, the president now. And we
wow.
like that
Yeah.
kind of branding.
This is kind of quite incredible, well, I don't even know what to say, that doesn't happen very often. But anyway, um, you mentioned the kind of dictatorial political regimes, and of course, Bayo's work is very critical of dictatorship, right, in the Philippines. Um, how do you feel recent politics, as well as the current direction of the politics in the Philippines, affects all the great work that has been done in terms of grassroots disaster risk reduction?
Yeah, that's I think that's a very relevant question now, especially after the last administration from 2016 to 2022, and in the early stage of the present administration. Uh, or political administration. Bello is always very critical of authoritarianism, corruption, neoliberal development policies, and because he saw these systems, especially that part of authoritarianism and dictatorship or dictatorial political regimes as the root causes of many development problems, and that one too on how dictatorial political regimes affect the grassroots DRR. As you see, I think in the Philippines we always say that, and we're so proud of it that we're champions. We're one of those champions of grassroots DRR, and I think we really made so much progress over the years in building community-based approaches and really in putting local communities at the center. And I think the role of civil society has been very important in the process. But I've also realized that that ideal situation where you have a strong grassroots participation really depends on the political environment. And just to give a concrete example, so I think from 2000 to 2016, we enjoyed that kind of very strong political grassroots engagement. But in 2016, under the Duterte administration, so that's the president who is now at The Hague in Netherlands under the trial for crimes against humanity because of his war on drugs that killed a lot of people in the from urban poor and rural poor communities. So they did that kind of war against. So there was also that kind of war against civil society groups. So many organizations, NGOs, even in international NGOs like I think Oxfam or Save the Children, and many of the NGOs that they support, they were branded as extremists, communists. So they're red tag. I think that's a Filipino term, red tag or red baited in I think that's so that that there was that atmosphere of fear and control that really weakened the space for participation. And stop me, Ksenia, if I'm talking a lot.
No, this is great. I will stop you.
Yeah.
Don't worry. So keep talking.
Yeah, but,
But
what's worrying in that environment or in that environment is that it leads to what I call the depoliticization of DRR. And in that situation, NGOs and communities are really discouraged from questioning development projects like the build, that displace them or that hold leaders accountable for unsafe policies. Because they would be labeled as communists or rebels or for fear of persecution. So in fact, when I wrote about that one paper on political persecution and violence against NGOs, and we presented that, I think I was also red baited, a red tag, and it's a terrifying experience. And I imagine that this is Bello's actual experience and many of his colleagues in the civil society. So that's I'll stop there for now.
But you kind of segued me to my next question to you in that so Bello is clearly a kind of an academic and an activist, and I think in recent years we've seen more scholars, more academics actually taking much more active, becoming more politically active, kind of recognizing that scholarship cannot just be objective and neutral, right? But with the way that political regimes unfold, I think in pretty much like every country, right, where where we can think, that academic freedom and the freedom to exercise your kind of political rights as well is becoming more and more stringent. Like, how do you feel about it?
It's Yeah, it's. I think if I understand from Belly's perspective, if I understand how what he thinks about it, and my view on it is that uh, I think that we also have to be. I can't find the word, but maybe to be honest, that the participation alone is not enough. It has
Mm.
to be political participation. The kind that challenges the unjust systems, and that and also really amplifies people's agency even under restrictive regimes, like that, like what we had in the last uh, 10 years. And I think that I think that is what we have to normalize here in the Philippines, that it's okay to question authority and be political about our positions. And I think, going back to Belly, that's something Belly's work continues to remind us. And whenever I read his work, uh, that every time you have to go back to that fundamental right of being able to uh, uh, to to resist the creation risk, which also means resisting the politics that sustain
Mm.
disaster risk creation. And I think that means really standing up against restrictive political regimes. I know that sounds very dangerous for some people, but there are, I think, successful ways of doing it
Yeah.
without really resorting to violence.
Mm. Super. Yeah. Thanks, Jake.
I wanted to try to connect with Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, especially as it relates to like systems that are oppressive. And when you were talking, Jake, it made me think especially of like resisting capitalism.
Mm.
And so Ballio and Thich Nhat Hanh had very different kind of approaches or processes and teachings. And Caroline, I just wondered what was going through your mind listening to Jake, like, and the like Thich Nhat Hanh talked about capitalism as like this voracious system that creates unhappiness, and I wondered about like the Buddhist teaching um, about mindful practice and how that also opposes this system from your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, before I answer that, I was thinking, Jake, while you were talking, one of the elements of disaster mental health, one of the things we want to restore for people after they've experienced the trauma of a disaster is a sense of efficacy.
Mm.
People need to feel like they have some sense of control over their life. And I've always felt that, also political control over the decisions that impact them is part of that. So I'd be curious to hear from you if you have witnessed or read anything related to building that sense of efficacy beforehand through things like grassroots disaster risk reduction. Does that seem to have an impact for people when a disaster happens? They already have access to that sense of increased efficacy. That's interesting to me, and an interesting, as a disaster mental health expert, I'm sometimes thinking about like prescribing political engagement to people as part of their recovery from a disaster. I can't exactly say it like that, but I have thought about that before. Related to Thich Nhat Hanh's work, mindfulness in the West gets taught as this, it's almost like a productivity tool. When I think from Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, if you really dive into them beyond some of I do think the seeds are contained in some of his more popular mindfulness books, because these are the seeds contained in Buddhism, that if you actually use your body and your perceptual apparatus in a contemplative way and engage with what's happening in the world, and if you could really feel and take in the enormity of the suffering caused by something like capitalism as related to other polycrises, if you could really feel that, the actions to take to alleviate that suffering would come naturally to you. You wouldn't have to think about the theory. You wouldn't have to do a lot of strategy. The compassionate step would come through you. I got to learn and practice this with a group called the Zen Peacemakers, where peace was not just this ideal of we'd like to have less conflict, this kind of conflict avoidant dominant Western perspective, but can I actually sit with the suffering that I'm witnessing and feel my urge to jump in to fix it or to turn away because it's overwhelming? Can I actually do something that's in between that, which is to witness in an engaged way? And then I think sometimes people think it ends there. It's just the witnessing. It's just the being mindful of it. But the compassionate step flows next. And nobody can tell you what that step is because each situation will require something different. So I think there's a lot of really important teachings about that if you really go through Thich Nhat Hanh's work. And something when I was doing research for this piece for the book, I had never read his diaries before, and seeing how he was tormented. He was witnessing the violence in his communities and it feeling like this intractable problem where, people on, all sides of the issue were experiencing harm, being harmed, him wanting to see the alleviation of that, but also just wanting this, he's like, how do I get people to care, to pay attention? I want to set fire to things. I think if people read that side of Thich Nhat Hanh and not the popularized, peace is the way, and people kind of seeing everything it takes to get to peace being the way, I think people might experience his teachings a little differently if they got that entire context.
Yeah, it's like a parallel to kind of what we're dealing with at a global level, or in a lot of the places we operate. Like that's a constant question that comes up with my students when we talk about systemic change, and how do you get people to change their consciousness, or how do you change a culture? Like these huge questions that and how do you get people that are doing the harm to change, right? It's a big thing.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just one of the lessons of I think that I got from my time with the Zen Peacemakers too is that we can't do that alone. And this is interpersonal neurobiology too, right? Like we experience ourselves as individuals because we live in the paradigm of Western individualism. Buddhism is giving us the tools to, with our whole body and mind, feel the fact that we are interdependent with each other and the entire Earth system. But as an individual, taking in all of that suffering can be harmful to yourself. So we need each other to do that. We need community to do that. I think that's where that relationship between interdependence and mutual aid becomes really clear to me. I think we evolved to do that. Our nervous systems evolved to do that through this kind of sense of mutuality that is really the reality of how we exist.
So we've been asking our guests who come on about their just looking forward, looking to the future of this interdisciplinary field of disaster studies. So Caroline, first of all, come to you on this. What is your biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice?
My biggest hope, I'm very fortunate I've been volunteering with a group called Climate Mobilization for a number of years. I think I connected with them on Twitter when it was called Twitter. They were just, asking for help with editing or something. And it's younger people, they're in their 20s. I had this value for myself of wanting to support younger people who are going to be living in the increased disasters of climate change more than I am, longer than I am. And when I see their analysis just is already including this sort of mutual dependence of researchers and research subjects working together to not just challenge the paradigms of power that are kind of keeping us seemingly locked into some of these systems, but truly building alternatives. I think researchers, scholars, and writers have a big role to play in giving language to that bridge. I think, again, things like indigenous methodologies, interpersonal neurobiology, there's so many different ways that we are recovering this sense of relationship between fields, relationship between disciplines. I think the more we as researchers can give language to that, it gives people a sense of some sort of infrastructure for working with that. So I hope more researchers are able to step out of kind of the academy, the ivory tower, go beyond like participatory action research and into truly kind of uncovering that mutual dependence that we all have and giving language to that for the communities that need this. We all do.
Thank you. Jake, what about you? What's your biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice?
Yeah, but like Caroline, I think it's really time for scholars like us or like many of us to go out of the university and do more practical works. And but my biggest hope now for disaster scholarship and practice is that we move beyond hopeful reformism, or that idea that change will come gradually. If we keep just improving policies or institutions, and I think that's because that's what we've been doing for so long, and I think we need more radical but practical changes. And I think one reason for that is time, and that usually we wait decades for ideas to take root. And I'm always reminded of Ben Wisner's early works in the 70s and 80s, and many of his colleagues. Many of the principles that we promote or celebrate today, or the buzzwords that we consider now, like the citizen science, equitable scholarship, or community participation, were already there in the 70s or 80s or even before. But it took us 30 to 50 years before they become real practices. And I think that with all the experiences of disasters and the gravity of disasters that we experience now, we cannot afford to wait that long again for good ideas, good to become practice. So when I say we need to move away from, just to clarify that, move away from hopeful reformism, I mean at least for us scholars, we need to, like Caroline, we need to do more or act now. And that we engage in practice, and practitioners must also engage in scholarship, and really dissolve that boundary between the university and the community, between the theory and the lived realities of the people that we work with. And just going back to Bello, I think his main and I agree with him that we have to be really political about it. And that means, again, what I said a while ago, it's really we start questioning the authority, challenging the system, and when possible, working with those in power to really push for real structural change, which I think is we're seeing now, because now we have that kind of national investigation for flood control projects that that I think is causing more disasters than mitigating them. And I think we see that problem now that, if we keep doing this the way we have it before, and this is what's going to happen. Nothing will change. And I think even politicians are seeing it now. And really, it's time for scholars or disaster scholars in particular to step up and be more engaged in practice in the politics of it. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, well, we live in hope. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Caroline. This was really great, and I love that we actually ended up on quite a positive note. That doesn't always happen on this podcast. So thank you for really having the hope and kind of expressing it so eloquently. It was great talking to you today. Thank you for your contributions to our book as well, and thank you for joining us today. It's been great. For those of you watching us or listening to us, join us in 3 weeks when we will continue talking about the Eastern thinkers. We will be back on the 10th of November, slightly later than usual, so 9 p.m. UK time. I don't know what time in the US because that's a weird void when everybody changes their time. But anyway, 9 p.m. UK time on the 10th of November, because we will be chatting to our colleagues in the Pacific who will be waking up very early for us yet again. Thanks you all for joining, and thanks Caroline and Jake for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.